Hello and welcome to another Scouching Report. So just recently we took a look at Slovakian prospect Adam Šikora for the 2022 NHL Entry Draft. And I found that starting around now would be a pretty fitting time to profile his more higher profile teammate Simon Nemec. And Nemec is a player that, at least from my perspective, as someone who takes a lot of questions from prospect people, is someone that literally everyone in their entire neighborhood wants to know more about and try to understand what's going on with this player. And he is a player who, in my opinion, is one of the more fascinating case studies in this year's NHL Draft. So to give some background, Simon Nemec has been on NHL radars since, from what I can tell, about 2019 to 2020, where he made his professional debut in Slovakia around his 16th birthday, which is certainly very impressive. In fact, in that league's history, just 3 players at that age have played 10 games or more in a season. And there has been a lot of talk about Simon Nemec, especially over the last 2 seasons. Some have him locked into the top 5 of this year's draft, but I do remain a little bit skeptical relative to that strong of a valuation. But don't let that confuse you. To me, Nemec is very clearly one of the best defensive prospects available in this year's draft, especially if his developmental trajectory is what I think it could be. So as usual, we'll start with the data, and here's where things get funny right off the bat. Of all the players I've done a video on this season to this point, Simon Nemec in total at 5-on-5 has played 20 more minutes, so this is a player that on a professional team is pretty heavily relied upon to eat up 5-on-5 minutes, which for a 17, 18-year-old defenseman playing pro hockey is already notable right off the top. And the data that I tracked, I think, shows a lot of the reasons why this might be. And it's very clear immediately that Nemec is a player marked clearly by his offensive transition and passing game. Amongst defenders I've tracked this year, he sits 8th in total offensive zone transitions. He sits 6th in controlled offensive zone transitions. And the percentage of offensive transitions where Nemec is involved crossed 30%, which is 4th amongst defensemen I've tracked this year. And funnily enough, that percentage of involvement offensively surpasses a lot of high-end offensive forwards in this year's draft, namely Jonathan Lekkerimäki, Matthew Savoy, and Frank Nazar. And another interesting insight is looking into how these transitions are gained for Simon Nemec. Of all of his attempted offensive transitions, 26% of them were completed through carrying the puck up the ice, and that puts him 10th amongst defenders I've tracked, but he sits 39th in terms of gaining those offensive transitions through completed passes. And just to get really granular here, in those offensive transitions where he attempted passes, he completed those passes 36% of the time, which isn't the worst in my data set, but it is notable, especially when you consider he literally didn't carry the puck across a blue line with control once when he tried in my data set. Now granted, a lot of players are well into the 80s and 90s% when it comes to maintaining control carrying pucks across blue lines, but most of them aren't playing pro hockey. And yeah, Slovakia is not the best pro hockey league, but it is really notable and I think indicates a clear strength and a key weakness in Simon Nemec's game when you look at how his transitions are generated. And just stepping out a little bit to look at general shot rates at both ends of the ice, Nemec's team generated a rate of dangerous shot attempts for that put him about 36th in my dataset amongst defensemen, but he created 31% of his team's shot attempts through shots himself or shot assists. And amongst my defenders this season that I've tracked, he's top 15 when it comes to sending passes into the slot. For a kid playing professional hockey and the level of minutes that he was playing, to me that's pretty impressive. And all that data put together makes me think that we're looking at not only one of the best offensive transition defensemen and offensive creating defensemen in this year's draft, but overall one of the better defensemen in this year's draft considering the level with which he's playing in. But when you flip the script to the defensive side of the game, things get really murky really quick with Nemec. Nemec's defensive transition involvement rate was below 20%, which puts him on par with some other defensemen that I have noticed as somewhat passive in Seamus Casey, Owen Pickering, and Maverick Lamoureux. And while his results in transition weren't necessarily poor at all, when you look at the rate with which the opponent enters the defensive zone with control of the puck when Nemec is involved, he allowed control on 35% of those entries, which puts him 32nd amongst defensemen I've tracked. And when you focus in on just when he's getting involved through stick checking, opponents were getting through him 50% of the time, which is certainly problematic, and we'll look into why this might be in the video section upcoming. And like the offensive data kind of lines up with what I'm seeing in Simon Nemec, I also think the defensive data lines up too in the video, so let's dig into why that is. So simply put, like the data might indicate, I find that Simon Nemec is one of the most talented puck-carrying defensemen in this year's draft with potential for something a lot more. And the first thing I noticed with Nemec is that he has a really strong ability to use his torso and positioning his legs and his body just to create a little bit of separation from forecheckers and give himself valuable time and space to skate up the ice with power, survey his options, and make reads. At this level, he can skate into pressure, but do it confidently with a lot of momentum and use some skill moves to get pucks through defenders, while also showing a capability of quarterbacking play, drawing in pressure, being aware of line mates, and continuing possession by sending passes back through that pressure. While Simon Nemec likes to challenge defenders one-on-one, or one-on-two, or even one-on-three sometimes, he can keep things a little bit simpler, showing strong line mate awareness, showing strong awareness of passing lanes and rushing routes that he can analyze and choose between on the fly, and after gaining blue lines with control, he has no issue getting pucks to line mates to maintain possession. And this didn't really happen that often, but I did also find that he could come off the boards with a lot of strength and skill, changing angles, getting into dangerous space, and trying to create chances for himself. But Nemec's awareness was on display a lot, especially when it came time to timing passes in transition to get pucks through to line mates. When under pressure, even in dangerous defensive scenarios, Nemec doesn't really seem to buckle under that pressure, and he's able to use relatively quick turns to evade that pressure and use those turns to find space and create new options for himself. And we'll get to Nemec's defensive game later on in the video, but he did seem to be a player that seemed to think a lot more about what I call preventative defense, as Nemec could pinch up from the blue line quite often to prevent breakouts from even starting, enabling more offensive zone possession time and extended offensive cycles. And that kind of defending, especially with a responsible forward group that can cover for him when he does pinch up, means that he just plays defense less of the time. And as the year went on, I certainly felt that Nemec took a step in his game when it came to confidence and deception, and an even better sense of timing his passes in the offensive zone. As later on in the year, anecdotally, I just felt like Nemec was a much more threatening playmaker than he was earlier in the year. And that offensive confidence and creativity came out at moments where you would absolutely be forgiven for thinking that Simon Nemec can play kind of like a forward at times. So again, this is a defender that is significantly involved in offensive transitions, and it's to the point where it's almost impossible for him to be this involved without jumping into the neutral zone and looking for offensive chances himself and jumping up in to participate with the forwards in the neutral zone. But with all that being said, I do have some concerns about Nemec really hitting the ceiling that he seems to display at this level in the next few years. But I did notice a few times in stride in those offensive transitions where he's skating with his head down, which can limit his ability to survey and analyze and read options on the ice. But a larger issue to me is that while I believe he's kinda quick in a straight line, and he does show some decent problem-solving skill in transition, I do think he kinda lacks truly high-end NHL prospect speed for a defenseman rushing pucks up the ice. And that skill and deception level seems relatively simplistic, solving single layers of defense rather than carving through multiple layers himself. And I just have a hard time seeing him as he is now without a lot of development doing what he's doing in the Slovakian League against NHL competition. The body positioning is definitely notable when he's at his best, but the lack of real high-end speed and evasion skill did kind of hem him in his own zone a little more often than I'd like. And there are times where you just feel Nemec is barely clinging to possession, moving pucks up the ice, even in a straight line. And the last thing you want is a puck-rushing defenseman losing the puck in transition, getting caught up ice, and you may have an odd man rush coming the other way. So now's a good time, I think, to move on to the other concerning part of Nemec's offensive transition game, which is when he thinks about passing the puck. He completed just 36% of his pass attempts in offensive transition scenarios, but he tried to do it a lot. Relative to the 31 carry attempts where he completed 30 of them, he tried 75 passes moving pucks up the ice. And the big question to me is, why is this happening? It's not uncommon, and it's usually a certainty that defenders will have more success carrying the puck up the ice than passing it, but this gulf with Nemec is pretty wide, especially when you look at how often he resorted to passing relative to how often he wanted to carry the puck up the ice himself. And honestly, when I watch Simon Nemec, I feel like his thought process breaking pucks out is pretty binary. He either tries to get pucks out of his own end and just off his own stick as quickly as he possibly can, or he'll make a read, use his feet, his hands, and his body positioning, to look for options and try to carry the puck out himself. When carrying pucks wasn't really an option for him, he could just lack the vision to see those lateral passing options into open ice to maintain possession, and just go off the glass and out, or just panic under pressure and get the puck out of the defensive zone as quickly as possible. And these passes were sometimes picked off at his own blue line, extending defensive cycles, when an easy pass attempt towards closer to the middle of the ice in the defensive end might be able to get you a breakout a little easier. But even with plenty of time and space to play with, I caught Simon Nemec on a number of occasions just surveying the ice and firing the puck down the ice for an icing. And this may be tactical or the fault of the team, and there were some instances where really good breakout passes from Nemec just bounced over his teammate's stick or weren't handled very well on the receiving end, and unfortunately in my data those things are kind of difficult to capture. And there were also instances where Nemec would have a bit of sloppy pass work in the defensive end, but there he is and he cleans it up, makes a read, and he's off carrying the puck up the ice himself. So if I were developing Simon Nemec from here, my focus would be on bringing out that carrying game a little bit more. Take some time, build on your evasion skill, build on your ability to generate speed and agility in transition, trust your feet, keep scanning for options, and be able to push defenses onto their heels more often than he did. He was far more effective in those scenarios than he was passing the puck around the ice. Are the passing issues fixable? Sure, I think with time and experience they certainly could be, but I just feel like that area of the game doesn't really play to his strengths as much as the carrying does. But what almost certainly isn't a tactical problem is Nemec's multifaceted defensive issues that I caught time and time again over the course of this season. The first thing I want to touch on is just his positioning on defensive entries, because it is, at times, kind of baffling. There's limited quickness coming out of pivots, he often renders himself a non-factor by being way too deep in the defensive end, and those large gaps that he naturally creates allows puck carriers to build speed and momentum, and it just makes it a lot harder for Nemec to defend the ice really, really well. This lack of real high-end quickness I thought also harmed him on defensive zone retrievals, as he lost battles here and there that in most situations he absolutely should not be losing. For defensemen, turning play around is not just about the turnover when you get the puck back on your stick. Getting pucks on sticks and being caught not in motion is something that can also extend defensive cycles, and this is something I caught with Nemec as well. He could be overtaken in full stride a little bit more easily than I would like without the speed and or strength to tie up opponents and really stick to them. But I do think for a lot of these issues, strength would go a long way to help, and for most kids playing professional hockey, yeah, strength will be an issue. And over time, I think with at least this close quarters defending, he'll get a lot more comfortable over the years, but it was on display as a good thing a few times in the games I tracked. It's just going to be a matter of getting comfortable in an all-around defensive scenario, being more defensively involved and engaged, and participating more with that added strength down the road that should round this out. With the puck, Nemec's awareness is pretty good, but away from the puck in the defensive end, if he could challenge a defender, he could get caught puck watching, lose track of guys in dangerous space, and this did bite him a little bit here and there. And there were some teachable moments with Nemec, especially early on in the year, where I felt that he was abandoning dangerous space, anticipating breakouts a little bit too early, and really trying to jump into those offensive rushes before they're really settled in, and that put him in really difficult defense pursuit scenarios. But there are also moments where I've seen Simon Nemec literally standing still in the defensive end, and to me that's a little problematic, and you're going to need to fix that if you're going to go up against bigger, stronger, faster, better NHL competition. So Simon Nemec to me is a player with clear upside, clear downside, clear potential, and a very clear style of play that certainly could work if you develop him properly. He may have good but not really great offensive talent right now in terms of projecting as a high-end offensive NHL player. The upside is there for an offensive possession quarterback defenseman moving pucks up the ice and creating chances in the offensive zone, but there are still question marks. So the best part of Simon Nemec's game to me is his puck carrying potential. It was something that didn't come out as often as it should have, but it is the thing that I constantly was pulling clips of because I found it his most impressive area of play. He drove great carrying data, and he did it with a lot of speed and power and pace pushing against the quality of competition he's against right now. He isn't afraid to jump into offensive rushes, he isn't afraid to quarterback those rushes, and he was doing so at a rate that was higher than most draft-eligible defensemen in this year's draft, especially amongst those who are playing pro hockey. It wasn't his most often unused skill, but he was certainly more reliable, dependable, and more confident in these scenarios. And having a defenseman that can put offensive responsibility on their own shoulders is certainly something NHL teams are looking for. The good part of Simon Nemec's game is his offensive playmaking. If that mobility and skill can improve a step over the next few years, combining that with his body positioning and his creativity could unlock massive potential for Nemec in his offensive game. He spots seams and passing opportunities both in transition and in the offensive zone really well, and he uses his hands and body sometimes to deceive and hide his options, which is something I felt came out a little more as the year went on with that added experience and confidence. And what was really impressive, especially later on in the year, is that his sense of patience and timing seemed to really come a ways. And leveraging this and nurturing it and getting him to be more confident and lean more into this side of the game could also be really beneficial for his projection. The not so good part to me is Nemec's passive defense, and this was something that just was very clear to me in many of the games that I tracked. The lack of really high-end mobility, skill, and strength did expose him in defensive situations more often than I would like, and that goes beyond his low rate of defensive transition involvement. I found many instances of just giving far too much space to forecheckers and just not really managing gaps at all. For example, the clip I'm highlighting here. I'm not exactly sure what's going on in this play here for him, but this type of defending probably won't allow him to play as much offensively as he does now at higher levels. At times, he could abandon his defensive positioning and chase breakouts when play wasn't particularly stable. And I think in this area of the game, there's going to really need to be some improvements in order to allow him to play more with the puck, which is where his strengths lie. So it's kind of weird. In the process of writing this video and finishing up my work on Simon Nemec this season, I kind of was reminded a little bit of a weird B-side version of Simon Edvinsson from last year. Nemec doesn't have the refined and straightforward defensive style of play that Edvinsson brought to the game last season, but the puck carrying and the flashes of offensive output and the real inability to connect on passes in transition at a relatively high level of play, they all seem to resonate, and in my view, Simon Edvinsson this year has taken a really big step because he seems to be more confident carrying the puck, playing with skill and mobility in transition, and really trying to drive more offense himself rather than trying to work off line mates. And for Nemec, this is kind of a trend that I think I might like to see myself. He's a strong puck carrier, but struggles with scanning for options consistently, and he created quite a few turnovers through these relatively poor passing decisions. There might be a learning curve here, but his natural instincts seem pretty hit or miss, especially when it came to getting pucks out of the defensive end. The big question for me here, like it is with any NHL draft prospect, is how do these things look further down the road? Because I felt that Nemec at this point is really pushing the limits of what he's capable of, and his style of play in the NHL requires a really high-end level of skating and skill in combination to be able to problem solve NHL defenses, find space, and transport pucks effectively. And I just don't know if I've seen that out of Simon Nemec just yet. Could it come? Sure. But I feel like he's falling just a little bit short of at least the really high bar of expectations that a player like him in the NHL might require. His skill problem solving in transition is certainly good, but I'm not sure how often he'll get away with playing against softer defensive systems like the one displayed in this clip. And to be as creative and productive as I think he could be, this is an area that I think he'll need to improve on. However, all that being said, I don't want to make it sound like I don't like Simon Nemec. I just want what's best for him. He brings certainly a strong brand of play that to me stands out amongst the defensemen in this year's draft. He got better over the course of the season in my view. It took me a little while to see it, but yeah, he is one of the better defenders in this year's draft. With time, he could develop into a really dependable and dynamic offensive puck transporter and offensive creator in the offensive zone. His ability to change angles in the offensive zone, get pucks inside the middle of the ice, and making plays in stride is unlike a lot of defenders this year. While he does need to cut down on the poor pass execution or poor passing decisions, these are things that coaches are paid to work with these young players on. But at the same time, seeing Nemec scanning the ice, looking around for options, and firing the puck down the ice for his nth icing of the game, at a certain point it just kind of made me chuckle. But through it all, I think at the end of the day, this could be a really impressive offensive defender for an NHL team. He's a really interesting puck quarterback with the potential for real serious improvement if his development goes right. He's evasive, he became more confident and creative as the year went on, and he showed pretty good potential in a lot of key areas, but also some pretty big weaknesses in other key areas that will need to be shored up a little. So the bottom line for me is, there's a good player here, but how good he'll be in the NHL, I think still remains to be seen. And he does come with caveats, but in 2022, I get the feeling that almost every NHL draft prospect this year comes with at least some caveats. And Nemec is a player that I think will be drafted relatively high, but I could also foresee a pretty wide range of outcomes for him depending on how teams might value other players. While I might be a little bit more skeptical than most, he remains a really interesting potential quarterback on defense this year, and I'll have my eye on him and keep my eye on him for the next few years regardless of where he goes in the draft in Montreal. So that's it for this one, and thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, you can click all the buttons below me so you never miss another one. If you really liked it, you could subscribe on Patreon or click join below to join my YouTube membership program. You'll get access to a data visualization tool suite, you'll get player cards, data sheets for hundreds of drafted and undrafted prospects around the world, and plenty of other goodies, or you can pick up some merchandise at the Scouchwear shop, where 50% of profits go to the Women's Sports Foundation. So that's all, and we'll see you in the next one.